The lights were low, the smoke hung heavy, and in that haze, a man named Wes Montgomery began to play. No pick in his hand, just the quiet touch of a thumb, drawing warmth from cold steel strings. His music didn't scream for attention. It spoke softly, like someone confessing a truth too personal to share. Wes never read a note of music, yet he made the guitar speak a new language. Each sound carried the ache of long nights, the weight of family, and the dream that never let him go. He was the heartbeat of jazz, and still, somehow, Hollywood let his name fade. How does a man who changed the sound of American music disappear from its memory? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the world ever knew his name, there was a boy growing up in Indianapolis, quiet, determined, and already carrying the kind of patience that would one day define his music. His real name was John Leslie Montgomery, born on the 6th of March, 1923, into a large family that knew struggle more than comfort. His parents separated early, leaving Wes and his brothers to move with their father to Columbus, Ohio. There wasn't much to hold on to in those days except hard work and the faint hum of music that seemed to live in the walls. His older brother, Monk, quit school to sell coal and ice, saving enough money to buy Wes his first guitar, a 4-string tenor from a pawn shop. It wasn't much, but for the Montgomery boys, it was a promise that somewhere beyond those Ohio winters, something beautiful could still be made. But Wes didn't fall in love with that guitar right away. He worked long hours, finished high school, and tried to make a living before music found him again. When he was 19, already married and working as a welder, he walked into a dance hall one evening with his wife. A record began to play the sound of Charlie Christian, the guitarist who had redefined jazz with Benny Goodman. That single moment changed Wes forever. He didn't just hear a song, he heard a calling. From that night on, every spare moment was devoted to the guitar. He had no teacher, no lessons, and no way to read sheet music. But he had persistence. Night, after long shifts at the factory, he would come home, turn the radio down low so the neighbors wouldn't complain, and try to copy every note Charlie Christian ever played. Soon, he realized something about the sound he was chasing. It wasn't his. He needed something more intimate, something that felt like him. So he began using his thumb instead of a pick, brushing the strings to create a softer, warmer tone. It wasn't a technique anyone taught him. It was born out of circumstance. The neighbors needed quiet. His hands found beauty in silence. That choice, simple and unplanned, would one day make him one of the most recognizable guitarists in jazz history. By the time he was 20, Wes was already performing in small Indianapolis bars. He played late into the night, imitating Charlie Christian's solos with remarkable precision. During the day, he returned to his job at a milk plant, exhausted but still thinking about melodies. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing peace. The local musicians began to notice him. People would whisper, "That's the kid who plays with his thumb." Some thought it was strange, others thought it was genius. Wes didn't care what they called it, he only cared that it sounded right. He had no idea that his sound, born in the quiet corners of Indianapolis, would soon echo across the jazz world. The 1940 period was not an easy time for a young black musician in America. Opportunities were scarce, and jazz was still considered underground, a music of rebellion and soul. But for Wes, it wasn't about rebellion. It was about expression, about telling the truth through 6 strings. When Lionel Hampton came to town in 1948 and heard Wes play, he recognized that truth immediately. Hampton hired him on the spot to join his orchestra, impressed by the young man's melodic phrasing and rhythmic precision. It was a dream opportunity, but it came with a cost. Wes was terrified of flying, so while the rest of the band traveled by air, he drove from city to city, town to town, sleeping in his car just to keep playing. He didn't mind the loneliness. The road gave him time to listen to his music, to his heart, and to the silence between both. Even then, success didn't change him. Between tours, Wes would return home to his wife and growing family, working long hours in the day, playing gigs at night, barely sleeping. He wasn't trying to become a star. He was trying to be a good man who happened to play guitar. There was something deeply American about his journey, that quiet endurance, that belief that hard work and heart could make up for everything you didn't have. In the years to come, that same humility would make Wes Montgomery more than just a musician. He would become a symbol of what it means to create beauty from struggle. Before the fame, before the records, before the world started calling his name, there was just a young man with calloused hands, a borrowed guitar, and a dream big enough to fill the silence of the night. When Wes Montgomery joined Lionel Hampton's band in 1948, it felt like the first door had finally opened. For years, he'd been playing in small bars, earning a few dollars a night, returning home before dawn just to get a couple hours of sleep before his factory shift. Now, he was standing on stage with one of the most respected band leaders in America. The crowds were bigger, the lights brighter, but Wes still played with the same quiet humility he'd always carried. The musicians around him were astonished. He didn't read charts or follow standard arrangements. Instead, he listened deeply, instinctively, and then played exactly what the music needed. That thumb of his didn't just pluck strings, it told stories. His tone was so warm it felt human, as if each note was wrapped in empathy. But the life of a touring musician was not as glamorous as it seemed. Wes had a fear of flying, so while the rest of Hampton's orchestra took flights from city to city, he drove his car sometimes hundreds of miles overnight to make the next show. Bandmates couldn't understand how he did it. He'd arrive exhausted, step onto the stage, close his eyes, and play like he had slept for days. That kind of dedication built him a quiet reputation. Jazz insiders began whispering about the young guitarist from Indianapolis who could play like Charlie Christian but sound like no one else. Even as his skills grew, fame was still far away. The road was long, the money small, and the separation from his family heavy on his heart. After 2 years with Hampton, Wes returned home, tired of the constant travel and eager to be with his wife and children. He worked again as a welder during the day, supporting his growing family, and played local clubs at night. By the mid-1950 period, he had become a fixture in the Indianapolis jazz scene, not because he was loud, but because he was honest. Crowds loved him. Musicians respected him. Yet beyond Indiana, no one knew his name. He played in small groups like the Eddie Higgins Trio and the Roger Jones Quintet, often alongside his brothers Buddy and Monk. Together, they formed what would later become the Montgomery Brothers, crafting a tight, soulful sound that blended family harmony with jazz improvisation. Still, Wes remained humble. When people asked him why he didn't move to New York to chase bigger opportunities, he'd just smile and say, "My family's here, that's enough." But fate was quietly working in his favor. In one smoky nightclub, Cannonball Adderley, already a jazz star himself, happened to catch Wes performing. Adderley was stunned. He later said Wes played like no one else alive. Within weeks, he called Orrin Keepnews from Riverside Records and insisted he listen to this man from Indianapolis. For Wes Montgomery, that moment would change everything. After nearly 20 years of playing in the shadows, he was about to step into the light. The world was finally ready to hear the sound he had carried in silence for so long. When Cannonball Adderley told Orrin Keepnews about the guitarist from Indianapolis, he didn't exaggerate. Keepnews, the producer behind Riverside Records, trusted Adderley's ear. One evening in 1959, he traveled to hear Wes Montgomery play. There, in a dimly lit club, surrounded by a crowd too small for the talent on stage, Keepnews saw what everyone else had missed. Wes stood calmly, his thumb brushing the strings like a man speaking to himself. There was no flash, no showmanship, just tone warm, round, and alive. Keepnews later said, "He played like he was having a conversation with the guitar. Every word meant something." Within weeks, Wes was signed to Riverside. For the first time, after nearly 2 decades of working nights and welding days, he was stepping into a studio not as a sideman, but as a leader. In early 1960, he recorded The Incredible Jazz Guitar of Wes Montgomery. The title wasn't just clever marketing, it was the truth. Backed by pianist Tommy Flanagan, bassist Percy Heath, and drummer Albert Heath, the sessions captured something rare: precision without coldness, emotion without excess. When the album was released, it didn't take long for the jazz world to stop and listen. Critics called it revolutionary. Gunther Schuller, one of the most respected music historians of the era, wrote that Wes had redefined the very language of modern jazz guitar. His phrasing was lyrical, his time impeccable. He could make a single note sing like a horn. For Wes, The recognition was overwhelming. He was still the same quiet man from Indianapolis, uncomfortable with fame but grateful for the work. "I just try to play the best I can," he told one interviewer. "If people like it, that's beautiful. If not, I'll still play." More albums followed moving along. So Much Guitar, Full House. Each one deepened his artistry, blending the soul of blues with the sophistication of jazz. Yet what set Wes apart wasn't just his technique, it was his humanity. He played as though every note had lived through something, through hunger, love, exhaustion, and hope. By now, audiences were starting to understand. At festivals in Monterey and New York, his name drew crowds who came not to dance, but to listen. His sound, once confined to small Indiana bars, now filled theaters. But Wes never changed. After every tour, he'd go straight back home to Indianapolis. He'd spend mornings taking his kids to school, evenings at the dinner table, nights back at the clubs. Stardom hadn't made him distant, it made him more grounded. "Fame is fine," he once said, "but my family keeps me in tune." That humility became his signature as much as his music. In a world obsessed with speed and flash, Wes stood still and let silence do the talking. The early 1960 period marked the turning point, the moment the world finally caught up to his genius. But beneath the applause, something remained unchanged. He wasn't chasing the spotlight, he was still chasing sound. The perfect note, the perfect feeling. For Wes Montgomery, success didn't mean being heard by everyone. It meant being understood by those who truly listened. By 1960, Wes Montgomery had become more than a musician, he was a revelation. The quiet man from Indianapolis, who once welded metal by day and played in smoky bars by night, now stood among the giants of jazz. His guitar didn't just fill rooms, it filled hearts. The release of the incredible jazz guitar of Wes Montgomery was only the beginning. What followed was a creative flood albums like Full House, So Much Guitar, and Boss Guitar, each one capturing a different shade of his genius. Every recording felt alive, as if the microphone itself could feel the warmth of his thumb on the strings. Critics compared his phrasing to that of a horn player, his melodic lines to poetry. At the Monterey Jazz Festival, the audience rose to their feet before he even finished his set. The applause went on, not loud and wild, but long and grateful, as if they all knew they were witnessing something rare. Fellow musicians watched him from backstage, some in disbelief. George Benson, still an up-and-coming guitarist, later said, "Wes showed us all what the guitar could really do." Yet, even at his peak, Wes carried himself with humility. He never strutted across the stage or demanded the spotlight. He stood slightly to the side, head tilted, eyes half closed, as if listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. That stillness became part of his legend. In 1962, he recorded Full House live at Subo, a small club in Berkeley, with Johnny Griffin, Wynton Kelly, and Paul Chambers. The energy was electric, the kind that happens only when talent and trust collide. Each note danced, yet every silence spoke just as loudly. That album became a milestone, proof that jazz could be both complex and deeply human. Offers poured in. Producers wanted him on bigger stages, larger audiences, and more commercial projects. But Wes was cautious. He had spent too long building something real to trade it for flash. Still, he understood the reality of life. 7 children to raise, bills to pay, and a career that demanded more than it ever gave back. Then came Verve Records and producer Creed Taylor, who saw in Wes the potential to bridge jazz and pop. Their collaboration began with Movin' Wes, a bold, lush album that brought orchestral arrangements into his sound. The record sold over 100,000 copies, a staggering success for a jazz guitarist at the time. Wes's name was suddenly everywhere: radio stations, television appearances, magazine covers. Yet even with fame closing in, he never lost that calm center. In interviews, he spoke softly, almost shyly, always steering the conversation back to music. "I just play what I feel," he'd say. It was the golden chapter of his life. Nights of standing ovations, days filled with music that seemed to touch every soul it reached. But beneath the glow of success, a quiet truth lingered. Wes Montgomery wasn't chasing stardom. He was still chasing sincerity, the same dream that began all those years ago in the dim bars of Indianapolis. Success, for most artists, is a blessing. For Wes Montgomery, it was also a quiet test of endurance. After Movin' Wes became a hit under Creed Taylor's direction, record executives saw something they hadn't before: a jazz musician who could sell like a pop star. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of his sound. Verve Records pushed for more accessible projects, albums that replaced the small, intimate trios with sweeping strings and radio-friendly melodies. Wes went along, not because he wanted to change, but because he wanted stability for his family. 7 children depended on him, and he had spent too many years living on hope alone. His next releases, Bumpin', Going Out of My Head, and California Dreamin', blurred the lines between jazz and pop. Some critics dismissed them as too commercial. Others called him a visionary for bridging two worlds. Wes didn't argue. He just played. And somehow, even beneath the lush arrangements and polished studio sheen, that same warm, human tone still reached through. But fame came with noise, and not all of it kind. Purists claimed he had abandoned true jazz. Magazine columns questioned whether he was selling out. Wes never responded publicly. Those close to him said the word stung, but he hid it behind that gentle smile. In truth, Wes Montgomery never cared for the labels. He didn't play for critics or markets. He played because music was his way of surviving the world. Yet the world had begun to demand too much. He was now touring constantly, recording, promoting, appearing on shows like The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson and the Hollywood Palace. For a man who once feared flying, the pace was brutal. Still, he carried himself with grace. Night after night, he stood under the lights, thumb brushing the strings, smiling for the crowd even when exhaustion lingered in his eyes. Behind the scenes, fatigue and pressure began to take their toll. His close friends noticed the blackouts, the coughing, the moments where he'd suddenly grow pale mid-performance. Wes brushed it off. Just tired, he'd say, but everyone knew he was pushing himself beyond what his body could bear. And yet, the music never suffered. In those years, he made his most soulful recordings, pieces that seemed to hold both beauty and ache in the same breath. There was something haunting in the way he played Windy or Tequila. They weren't just melodies anymore. They were reflections of a man trying to balance art, family, and the weight of expectation. By 1967, Wes had become a crossover sensation, invited to festivals, honored in magazines, and celebrated as the bridge between jazz and the mainstream. But when he returned home to Indianapolis, everything felt quieter. The phone calls stopped. The crowds disappeared. Only the sound of his guitar remained, echoing softly through the house as his children drifted to sleep. He was still a giant, but giants get tired too. Some nights he'd look at his hands, the same hands that had built a legacy, and say softly, "I just want to rest." In the glow of his success, few noticed how fragile he'd become. To the world, Wes Montgomery was thriving, but inside, the light that had guided him for decades was beginning to flicker. By the late 1960 period, the applause that once lifted Wes Montgomery had begun to echo differently. It was still loud, still loving, but behind each cheer, there was fatigue. His days had turned into an endless loop of travel, rehearsals, interviews, and recording sessions. The life he had built out of passion had quietly become a race against his own exhaustion. Wes was only in his early 40s, but he carried himself like an old man. His friends noticed the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. He was always polite, always kind, but his eyes told another story, one of sleepless nights, chain-smoked cigarettes, and too many miles on the road. Every performance came at a cost. He'd step on stage, smile for the crowd, and let his thumb glide across the strings as if everything were fine. But after the show, he would sometimes sit in silence, breathing heavily, staring at the guitar on his lap. To him, it wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was both salvation and burden. Despite the growing pressure, he refused to slow down. He told himself it was for his family, the reason he'd worked so hard in the first place. 7 children, a mortgage, a dream that needed to keep paying the bills. So he said yes to every tour, every contract, every appearance. Those closest to him, his brothers, Buddy and Monk, tried to convince him to rest. But Wes would only shake his head and say, "I'll rest when it's time." In truth, he couldn't stop. The music was his life, and life without it felt unimaginable. But the body has limits the heart doesn't see. During one performance in New York, Witnesses remembered seeing him grow pale mid-song, his hand trembling slightly as he finished the final chord. He laughed it off afterward, joking that the lights were too hot. But deep down, he knew something was changing. The industry had begun to shift as well. The jazz clubs that once celebrated him were closing, replaced by new sounds, new audiences, new idols. Wes never complained, never spoke bitterly. He simply kept playing, letting the guitar say everything he couldn't. At home, he found peace in small things, walking his kids to school, mowing the lawn, sitting quietly on the porch with his wife. For those moments, the weight of fame seemed to lift. But even in silence, the strain remained. His heart was working too hard, his body too tired to keep up with the rhythm that had once carried him through life. There was no scandal, no fall from grace, just a slow fading of light. The world saw a man at the height of his success. What they didn't see was how much it cost him to keep shining. As the nights grew longer and the tours more demanding, Wes Montgomery was fighting a battle no one could see, one that wasn't against fame or critics, but against time itself. In June 1968, Wes Montgomery came home from a tour feeling more tired than usual. Indianapolis was warm that week, the kind of heat that makes the air heavy. He had just returned from California, where he'd been recording and performing non-stop. To everyone around him, he seemed calm, almost peaceful. He talked about taking a break, spending more time with his family, maybe even cutting back on touring. For once, it sounded like he meant it. On the morning of June 15, he woke up, kissed his wife, and sat down with his guitar. Neighbors later said they heard him playing softly, as if testing a melody that had been lingering in his mind. Then, without warning, the music stopped. A heart attack. No struggle, no cry, just silence. He was 45 years old. News spread quickly through the jazz world. Clubs went quiet. DJs on late-night radio shows spoke his name with trembling voices. Musicians who had shared stages with him, Cannonball Adderley, George Benson, and Quincy Jones, all called his passing unthinkable. In New York, a writer for Downbeat magazine wrote, "Wes Montgomery didn't just play the guitar, he gave it a soul." In Chicago, a young guitarist broke down during a set, unable to continue after playing the first few bars of 4 on 6. Across the country, in the dim light of record stores, people lifted his albums gently, as if afraid the sound might break. For his family, it was more than the loss of a legend. It was the loss of a husband, a father, the man who came home tired but always smiling. His children remembered him sitting in the living room, guitar resting on his knee, nodding to the rhythm of their laughter. At the funeral, friends said the service felt like his music soft, unpretentious, and full of heart. No spectacle, no grand farewell, just respect. The industry moved on quickly, as it always does. New artists, new sounds, new trends. But for those who truly listened, there was a void that no one else could fill. The warmth, the thumb, the quiet honesty of his tone, it was gone. Wes left behind 10 albums produced by Creed Taylor, 8 of which leaned toward the pop market. But those who loved him knew the truth. His greatest work wasn't defined by genre. It lived in the spaces between jazz and soul, between ambition and humility, between life and silence. In that final moment, guitar in hand, Wes Montgomery didn't leave unfinished notes. He left echoes soft, timeless, and impossibly human. When Wes Montgomery passed, the silence that followed was deafening. But from that silence, something remarkable began to grow. His influence didn't fade, it multiplied. Across America, young guitarists started picking up his records, listening to that unmistakable tone, the warmth, the clarity, the tenderness. They didn't just hear notes. They heard a man speaking through his instrument. Every phrase was personal, every chord a confession. For many, that was the moment they fell in love with jazz. In the years that followed, his spirit lived on in the fingers of those he inspired. George Benson, who had once watched Wes from the crowd in awe, carried his influence proudly. "Wes didn't just teach us how to play," Benson once said. "He taught us how to feel." Oh? Pat Metheny, Lee Ritenour, and Joe Pass all credited him as the reason they chose the guitar. Each of them, in their own way, carried forward that sense of humanity that Wes brought to jazz. But Wes's legacy wasn't just technical, it was emotional. He changed how people thought about what a guitar could say. He proved that you didn't have to shout to be heard, that music could be powerful even when played softly. His tone became a metaphor for compassion, strength without aggression, mastery without arrogance. Long before the word fusion became popular, Wes had already built the bridge. His music connected jazz to blues, soul, and even pop, making it accessible to listeners who had never cared for improvisation before. Albums like Movin' Wes and Going Out of My Head opened the door for a new generation of crossover artists. What critics once called commercial would later be seen as visionary. In classrooms and conservatories, his name became a quiet presence, not shouted from the walls, but whispered with reverence. Teachers pointed to his phrasing, his rhythmic subtlety, his thumb-picked lines that seemed to breathe. To study Wes Montgomery wasn't just to study jazz. It was to study restraint, patience, and soul. Even today, decades later, his recordings feel alive. The opening bars of West Coast blues, the soaring solo in 4-on-6, the delicate emotion in Days of Wine and Roses, they sound as intimate now as they did the day he played them. Technology may have changed, but the feeling hasn't. In a world obsessed with speed and perfection, Wes's music reminds us that beauty often lies in imperfection, in the small pauses, the human touches, the moments when sound almost breaks. His guitar was never about precision, it was about honesty. He left behind more than albums or awards. He left a way of listening, a way of feeling. For musicians and audiences alike, Wes Montgomery became a compass pointing toward the truth that music isn't just performance, it's presence. And for those who still press play on his records late at night, the magic remains the same. It's as if he's still there, thumb brushing the strings, head tilted, eyes closed, teaching the world once again how to listen with the heart. For years after his death, the music industry moved on. The 1970 period arrived with new trends, rock, funk, electric jazz, and the quiet sound of Wes Montgomery seemed out of place in a world chasing volume and spectacle. Record stores replaced his albums with newer names. For a while, it felt as though the man who gave jazz its most human voice had been forgotten. But time, like melody, has a way of circling back. In the late 1970 period, a new generation of musicians began to rediscover him. College students digging through vinyl bins found the incredible jazz guitar of Wes Montgomery and played it in their dorm rooms. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard. Warm, pure, intimate. It didn't age, it glowed. By the 1980 period, critics started to rewrite the narrative. What had once been dismissed as too commercial was now celebrated as visionary. Writers in downbeat and jazz times called Wes the bridge between authenticity and accessibility. His music, they said, had democratized jazz, made it emotional again, personal again. In 1993, more than 2 decades after his death, Wes Montgomery was inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame. The ceremony was quiet, fittingly so. Musicians and historians spoke not in grand speeches but in gratitude. George Benson performed Windy, closing his eyes midway through, as if still listening to his mentor's spirit. Television specials and documentaries followed. NPR revisited his life in heartfelt retrospectives, calling him the poet of the jazz guitar. Even Hollywood began to look back, using his recordings in films and series to evoke nostalgia, to capture the sound of sincerity in an age that often lacked it. Yet the truest tribute came not from institutions, but from listeners. Across the world, fans began leaving comments on reissued albums and online forums, sharing memories of discovering Wes's music in their parents' collections or hearing it by accident on a late-night radio show. A man in Chicago wrote, "My father played Wes every Sunday morning. Now that he's gone, I still play it. It feels like home." In Japan, where jazz had always found a loyal following, collectors treated his records like sacred artifacts. In Europe, festivals began dedicating stages to his legacy. And in America, his home, his soil, small jazz clubs once again played 4-on-6 to audiences who weren't even born when he died. His story, once defined by struggle and loss, had quietly transformed into one of redemption. The world that forgot him had found him again, not through fame, but through memory. It's strange how history works. Some stars blaze fast and burn out. Others, like Wes Montgomery, shine quietly, waiting for the right hearts to notice. His music didn't demand attention. It earned love slowly, honestly. Today, his influence is everywhere in the phrasing of a solo, in the warmth of a tone, in the courage to play softly when the world plays loud. They say true art never dies. Listening to Wes Montgomery proves it. The man may be gone, but every time that thumb brushes a string, somewhere, somehow, it feels like he's still here, reminding us that the soul of jazz never really fades. The story of Wes Montgomery doesn't end with his final note. It lingers, like the soft echo of a chord fading into silence. Decades have passed, yet his music still feels alive, breathing through the hands of every guitarist who ever wanted to make their instrument sing instead of shout. When you listen closely, you can almost see him again, standing under the soft glow of a stage light, head tilted, thumb brushing the strings as if he's coaxing out a secret. That sound was never about fame or technique. It was about truth, the kind that can't be taught, only lived. Wes came from ordinary beginnings, worked with his hands, raised a family, and played from the heart. He didn't seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway. He changed jazz not by force, but by honesty, showing the world that power can come from gentleness and that silence can speak louder than applause. Even today, when we hear 4 on 6 or West Coast blues, something happens, a quiet recognition that the soul behind those strings is still with us. His tone carries the patience of a man who knew struggle, the humility of a father who loved deeply, and the courage of an artist who never stopped searching for beauty. Wes Montgomery's story reminds us that greatness doesn't always come wrapped in glory. Sometimes it hides in small acts, in late nights of practice, in sacrifices no one sees, in the decision to keep playing when the world isn't listening. He taught us that the true legacy of an artist isn't measured in fame, but in how many hearts still remember the sound. So tonight, if you find yourself alone with your thoughts, put on one of his records. Let that thumb-picked melody fill the room. Close your eyes and listen not just to the notes, but to the man behind them. Because some stars don't fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see. Do you think Wes Montgomery ever got the recognition he truly deserved? If this story touched you, leave a message for him in the comments. Tell us where you first heard his music or how his sound made you feel. And if you believe legends like Wes deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive one story at a time. The world may forget, but here, on this channel, we remember.